Okay, I really dropped the ball on this one. Let me explain. Yesterday we shot the video about the crankshaft, and we went back to the house and Kathy did the editing and the loading of the video and all that other stuff, and I came back here and started working on stuff. The video was up and I didn't read the comments. A lot of you guys, probably a dozen of you, were like, did you ring the crank? Can you ring the crank for us so we can see if it's cracked or not? It didn't even enter my mind. I was so excited to find out exactly what it looked like inside that I came back here to the shop and I grabbed the spinning wheel of death and I hacked the front of the crank off because I wanted to see what those cracks actually did, where they were. Now, to answer the question as to what would have happened if I rang the crank, you ready for this one? It would have sounded perfect. Ringing the crank is not an end all. And I'll explain this in a minute. I cut the crank because I wanted to see exactly what was going on inside of it. I've got to put my glasses on. And here's a tip for you guys. You know, you hit like 40 years old. When you hit like 40, it's like it happens universally. When you hit 40 years old, your eyes start to go and you start to lose those details. And if you don't like get yourself some readers and stuff like that, it actually becomes very frustrating to work on stuff. A lot of guys give up on tinkering with cars and stuff like that because they get to that point where it's just like you can't really see. You don't realize that your eyes are going. It just becomes more difficult. So, readers, very important. So I cut the crank. Now this is I got to point this out. You're going to see a couple of marks in here that look like occlusions. This one here, this one here. Those aren't. What happened was I could only get so far with the cutting wheel, and then I hit the crank, I broke it with a hammer, and then afterwards I took this part of it to the the grinder, and I smoothed it out. So this is actually damage that I did, not damage that was inside the crank. But again, I wanted to see exactly where those cracks went to. So here's what I found. Okay, so first things first is it wasn't one crack. It was a bunch of cracks. So here was one right here. This is two, and this is the one that I was actually able to feel, this one. Here's three, here's four, and here's five. So it actually has 5 cracks. Now the interesting about these cracks is that they don't extend into the center of the crank at all. They're just on the surface. These you would have picked up on a magnaflux. But it would not, they don't extend anywhere into the center of the crank. Now, let's go back and let's talk about when you ring a crank to see if it's got life or not. What you do, see, a crankshaft is a spring, and because of its nature, as it's always spinning, it's absorbing pressure pulses and flexing and doing all sorts of things. And in order for it to always return to its original shape, it has to have a spring-like quality. So let's say you took a brand new crankshaft, freshly machined, brand new, and you ring it. It's gonna ring like a bell. Like for instance, we tested this one. This crank actually has a lot of life in it. Now, if you had taken a crank, like this is a brand new, fresh crank, and you rang it, it would sound a little bit cleaner than that, but you would have that kind of ring. Now let's just say you took that crank and you stuck it in a furnace and you heated it till it was red and then let it cool. When you came back to do this, you wouldn't get a ring. It would just be dead. It would sound like a piece of wood because you took the spring, you took the temper out of the spring with the heat. Now in this case, the failure of the crankshaft had nothing to do with the temper of the metal or the condition of the metal. It had to do with trauma that was imposed on it. So basically what was happening was the motor is spinning, you've got the 5 cylinders behind this thing turning it, and you've got one that's trying to lock up. So it cracked, stress cracked right here because the thing tried to flex to the point that it was beyond its ability to spring. But the metal itself in here is perfect. Now in this case, this crank probably could have been cut 30 or 40 thousandths of an inch, and those cracks would have disappeared. Because again, see, let's look very carefully right here, and we can't see this crack extend anywhere into the center here. So this crank probably could have been cut and these cracks would have disappeared. On the other hand, if you had ignored these and just ran this thing, these cracks, due to the flexing nature of the crankshaft, these cracks would slowly work themselves in, and at that point you would actually hear it, because the crank, you would have two different tones. You would hit this and you would hit the main part of the crankshaft and you would get two different tones out of it. But ringing the crank will not tell you that you've got surface cracks here. So that's the important distinction. If we had rung this crank before I cut it apart, it probably would have sounded good. In fact, I know it would have sounded good. So that's not the end-all be-all. Ringing a crank gives you an idea of its overall condition. And unless you've got a crack that's actually starting from the center out, you're probably not going to hear it on a ring. Now, one other thing, I saw a comment, somebody talked about the journal being undercut. And it's not undercut. And also, this is important, Chrysler cranks of this era have a rolled fillet. And what they do is, when they machine this crank, there's a press that they actually roll this section of it deeper. That's what these lines are. You're going to have it on either side of the journal. You can see it right here. So that rolled fillet, what it does is it compresses the molecules, it compresses the metal right here, and actually adds strength in this cheek area. These cracks are unusual. You know, I can't remember seeing another crank crack this way, this particular way. Generally, what you'll see is the crack right here in the fillet. This one straight across. So it's definitely an unusual thing. I'm kind of sorry I didn't cut this thing first, because it was a really nice crank. It rang really good, but you know, it is what it is. So, and then, other guys were talking about can you just take a forged crank and cut it down to get the weight out of it, cut down the counterweights. You can, but it's not worth the effort. You got to remember something about this particular engine. On its best day, like to the moon on its best day, it won't make 300 horsepower. It's probably a 250, 275 horsepower motor with everything sorted out. It simply does not make enough power to justify the amount of machining, the time and the effort that it would take to turn a forged crank into a lightweight piece like this. So under normal circumstances, meaning like no trauma, things aren't like binding up and the motor's not trying to lock up on itself, the cast crank would be more than up to the task. So it's just not worth it to do that kind of thing. Now, if this was a turbocharged car, or if this was a nitrous car or supercharged, anything like that, where you're looking at really putting some power to this thing, then yeah, absolutely, man, go with the forged stuff. But for this, it's like a weed whacker. It really doesn't make any power. The key to this whole operation, this whole car, is lightness, reduced parasitic drag, less reciprocating weight. So that's where I'm trying to make this car work. It's not a matter of making power. It's not going to make any power, so to speak. So that's why we've decided to go with these parts and stick with these parts. And again, the failure had nothing to do with the engine itself or the crankshaft or the connecting rod. The failure had to do with my not going as far as I should have in deepening the sump, or at least configuring the back of the sump so it didn't create a ramp for the oil to just run away from the pickup. So now that'll be the next step. We'll do a whole thing about that. So there you go. To ring or not to ring, right? It would have run. I hope you got something out of that. I'll see you tomorrow.